Welcome to Castrol's Motor Oil 101. Oil's the lifeblood of your engine, and that's what this presentation's about, motor oil. We're going to teach you everything you need to know about motor oil. We're going to talk about its purpose and function. We'll look at some types of motor oils. We'll discuss some API and some viscosity ratings, and we'll discuss some additives that go into this motor oil. Now, we even have with us Tim Miranda, who's a senior engineer for Castrol.
And we're even going to take you through a complete oil change and share some tips with you on service and inspections along the way.
Now, I know we're all pretty confident when it comes to performing oil changes, so we'll take a look at some of the systems underneath the vehicle and up under the hood that may need some attention. Now, there's no time to waste, so let's get started with oil basics. All right, let's take a look at the motor oil basics. This will help you serve your customers with confidence because you'll know exactly what it does. Now, motor oil cleans, cools, protects, lubricates an engine, but I think it's more important if we take a look at it in action. And I got a couple steel plates right here. And what if I take these steel plates and I simply just rub them together? You can hear them grinding. Because what oil does, it creates a film. It creates a film in between all these moving parts in this engine here. And I can show you here by putting a little bit of oil. And then I rub them together. Can't hear it anymore because it's creating a film between the two parts. And we can see that in action right here with this overhead cam engine. Now, this overhead cam engine actually has passages that go through the whole complete engine. You can see down here where the crankshaft's running, all these connecting rods and main bearings have a thin film of oil. Now, if you move up here, you can actually see this is an overhead cam. So each one of these cam bearings actually have an oil gallery that allows the oil to come up here and lubricate each one of these cam lobes. They spin around and they go on these flat tappets or followers, which actually opens and closes the valves. Now, all the lubrication has to take place up top and below here, or this engine's going to have problems. Now, on an overhead valve engine, it's a little bit different, but it's the same concept. You can see right here, this is an overhead valve engine because the valves are up here and the cam's in the block. And what we're looking at here is the lifters. Each one of these lifters are filled up with oil, and then with oil pressure, they're going to pump up this push rod right here. And as they come up the push rod, they have to squirt out here and lubricate all these moving parts. Oil is very important. So if I spin it over, you can actually see each one of those rocker arms are moving, and oil has to happen. Now, oil also has to get back down to the bottom, so let's take a look at the bottom end here. Now, down here what we have is we actually have the crankshaft. The crankshaft goes completely down the engine, and you can see here some main bearings, and then there's some connecting rod bearings right here. So what happens when I spin this over, this crankshaft's going to run, the main bearings are going to spin with a film of oil, the connecting rod bearings are all going to spin with a film of oil, and then it all starts right here with the oil pump. The oil pump's going to go ahead and pressurize it, take it through the oil filter, and run it through all the oil galleries. So if I spin this one over down here, you can see everything moving. Now, obviously there's no oil pressure in this engine, but there would have to be in order to support these bearings. You can see right here, I have an actual thrust bearing. Now this bearing here, this one's in pretty good shape. You can see here, has a little wear pattern, but this has been maintained well. Now this one here, on the other hand, not so much. You can see here where the actual bearing actually got worn out. This engine here was starving for oil. Maybe it had the wrong oil, or maybe the customer wasn't informed on what they should put in their vehicle. So that's important. That's your role. You have to go out there and educate them on oil basics so their engine doesn't end up like this. Now that you understand the basics of motor oil, we have to understand a couple of different types of motor oil. So we have with us Tim Miranda, a senior engineer from Castrol. Tim, right here we have some conventional oil and we have some synthetic oil. What's the difference?
Well, John, the real basic difference comes down to the base oil types that are used in engine oil. We have conventional oil, conventional base oil, and synthetic base oil. There's also synthetic blend, which is a blend of conventional and synthetic. But where do they come from? The crude oil is actually the starting point for conventional base oil. It goes into the refinery. We get a cutoff known as conventional base oil. We can take conventional base oil and do a lot of chemical restructuring on it to make it a superior base oil product, and that's where we get synthetic base oil from.
Now what about that mid-blend, that semi-synthetic?
Right, semi-synthetic, partial synthetic, synthetic blends, those are a mixture of conventional base oil and synthetic base oil.
Wow, so you heard it from Tim. There is a difference in oils. Now with oil types comes viscosity ratings. Tim, what can you tell our professionals about viscosity ratings?
John, the viscosity ratings that we see on the bottles are examples. This is an example of a multi-viscosity engine oil rating. The first number that ends with a W is the winter viscosity rating. That's the ability of the oil to flow and protect properly under cold conditions. The second number that we see is the high temperature number, and that's the ability of the oil to provide correct viscosity at high temperature to protect the bearings inside the engine.
Now it's almost like the flow of it, and we got a cool demonstration where we can show you the thickness of the oil. Right here we have 80 weight oil, and over here we have 5W30 oil. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these little balls here and I'm going to drop them in the beaker. And when I drop them in the beaker, the 80 weight oil, the ball is going to travel really, really slow. And then the thinner oil, it should go a lot faster. So let's drop them in and see what happens. Now you can see the lightweight oil, it's flowing right through there, and the thicker oil, it's having a hard time getting through there. Now I know there's two other things that are on these oil bottles. One's a donut and the other's the Starburst. Could you help us out with those?
Sure, John. The donut is always on the back of the bottle, and that's this symbol right here. And that's a symbol that you have to earn to put onto the bottle. It requires passing a number of industry standard engine tests, bench tests, and chemical tests. They're very rigorous tests, so to be able to put that symbol on the bottle means that you have to pass all those tests. In the donut is a bunch of consumer information. On the top is the current API performance classification. In the middle is always the viscosity grade. And the bottom part of the donut is reserved for resource conserving, which means that it's a fuel economy engine oil, or it helps preserve the emission system.
Now I was always told also that the latest and greatest alphabetically, doesn't it go up higher as the better oil, or is that just a myth?
No, that's correct, John. Actually, the very first oils were API SA oils from the 1930s, 1940s. We've since progressed to the current category of API SN, which is a very highly engineered engine oil, which has to match the performance requirements of today's engines, the high performance engines that are on the road. So the categories get tougher as we go through historically.
I understand. What about the Starburst?
Well, the Starburst is really kind of tied into the donut. If we have an energy conserving oil, which is a fuel economy grade oil, it is going to have the Starburst on the front of the bottle, and that's a symbol that helps the consumer recognize the oil. Quite often they see this in the owner's manual where it recommends to have a Starburst engine oil.
Now, don't the Europeans use a different rating system?
Yes, John, actually they do. The system in Europe is a very stringent system. It's actually more challenging to pass than the American system. And the system in Europe is called ACEA. It's spelled A-C-E-A. And it has a number of different categories, much different than the United States API system has. Beyond both of these systems, also the OEMs have their own internal specifications that they have for their engine oils. And quite often these specifications go beyond the industry standards, whether it's API or ACEA, so that the OEMs protect the hardware that they have on the road.
So with these symbols, you can rest assured you're getting an oil that meets the industry standards. When it's time to change the oil, perhaps the oil light reminder has come on, or you may have a percentage in your dash that actually shows you when it's time to change the oil, or if you're not sure, check the owner's manual. It'll tell you the oil change intervals that's right for your car. Now there's a lot of specs that go along with that, and the choices are very important that you need to make. First of all, I just pulled a cap off, and right on the cap it says it's an SAE 5W20. That cap comes from the vehicle, that's the oil that goes in it. You might still want to check the owner's manual. It could be the wrong cap. Now also here, this is the actual owner's manual out of the Mazda here, and this can be confusing as well. You see right here it says 520, yet it says 530 here. So what's going on? This is the 2.5 liter, which is in our car, and this is a 2.3 liter, which may be in another car, which calls for a 5W30 oil. So we talked about earlier, all the Starburst, we talked about the ratings, everything's right here in the owner's manual. Tim, I know that diesels play by a whole different set of rules.
That's right, John. Diesels are an example of why we want to check the owner's manual, because the requirements for diesel engine oil are different than they are for gasoline engine oil. So really critical to check the owner's manual with a diesel to find out what the requirements are for that. That's another example of also looking for the OEM requirements. It's not just the viscosity that we want to look at, it's just also the viscosity plus the performance requirements that the OEM has for that particular vehicle.
So when it's time to change the oil, make sure you get the right oil, the right selections, the right quantities. You can go right to the point of sale. It'll tell you everything you need to know. That system will work every time. If you're not sure, check the owner's manual, the cap. There's several resources, but the key is to get the right oil into the vehicle, whether it's transmission fluid or engines. You could do catastrophic damage if you don't have the right oil. Tim, I know there's a lot of additives that go into motor oil. Now I have a whole card here of additives. If I read them off to you, perhaps you can share with us what they do. Now the first two are detergents and dispersants.
John, the role of detergents is to prevent the inside of the engine from getting dirty. The role of the dispersants is to take the potential contaminants that would be in the engine oil and suspend them in the engine oil so that when we drain the oil, we drain the contaminants with the engine oil.
Okay. What about viscosity improvers?
Viscosity improvers are actually polymers that are in the engine oil, and their role is to stabilize the viscosity of the oil both at low cold temperatures and also at high temperatures under operating conditions.
Oh, the different viscosities.
Yes.
Oh, very good. What about antioxidants?
Well, the role of the antioxidant is to prevent oxygen from attacking the engine oil, and that if that's allowed to occur, we can have deposit formation. So antioxidants are very critical.
I see. What about also there's anti-wear agents? That sounds pretty self-explanatory.
Sure, anti-wear agents are exactly as they say. They help prevent against wear in highly loaded areas inside the engine. Friction modifiers are to help make slippery surfaces so that parts move more easily against each other, and this helps with fuel economy.
And I know there's also anti-foaming agents.
Yes, John, the role of the anti-foam is to prevent formation of bubbles in the engine oil. We don't want air bubbles getting into the bearing area. They just don't provide very good lubrication like engine oil does.
All right, and we could show that right here actually. The actual foam agents, I know a little bit about that because the crankshaft spins around. That's going to whip that oil up and create a lot of air.
Yes.
Now one other one, corrosion inhibitors.
The job of the corrosion inhibitor is to prevent rust formation from moisture that enters the inside of the engine.
So really the anti-additives or all the additives in there, the anti-dispersants, detergents, and everything we just talked about really makes the oil package?
Yeah, it's a critical choice between the types of engine oil additives and the performance of the engine oil additives that helps differentiate engine oils.
Now transmission fluid, it does the same thing as motor oil, except it's specifically for transmissions. But the most important thing is making the right selections. Now there's a bunch of transmission fluids out there and there's different transmissions. There could be 5 different transmissions in one make and model of vehicle. So make sure you consult the OEM's manufacturer service manual and the OEM specifications when it comes to the fluid so you make the right choice every time. Now, with all this knowledge, you'll serve your customers with confidence. Now we're ready to perform our oil change. But before we do, the most important thing to remember is safety. We have our gloves on and our safety glasses. And also, we're dealing with a twin post lift here. You may be dealing with an oil pit. Just follow the proper procedures for whatever situation you run into when you're changing your oil. Now, we're gonna do more than just an oil change. We're gonna go into a checklist. Everybody's procedure is a little bit different, but this is a checklist that we can look at here. Talks about doing the oil change, but as a professional, you're gonna do so much more than that. We're gonna look at the engine coolant, the transmission fluid, cabin filter up under the hood a little bit later, tire rotation, spark plugs, accessory drive belts. They're counting on you to look at all this stuff. Now you come down here, we actually got brakes. You're gonna look at some of the brake components. Now, think about it for a minute. You're rotating the tires. Why not just take a look at the brakes, the calipers, the rotors? Make sure the car's safe. The customer's counting on you as a professional to do that. We come down over here and you can see the horns, everything from the radiator, the constant velocity, the clutch, if it's equipped, exhaust systems, oil filters, fluid steering systems, and then we get to the tread depth gauge. Just take a tread depth gauge, come over here, stick it in the tire, and check out their tires. This one here happens to have 730 seconds left on it. These tires are in good shape. Now Chase is ready to perform our oil change. Chase, what can you share with our viewers here?
Well, to perform oil change, this is how I like to do it. The first thing I like to do is make sure I got my safety glasses on and my gloves. And then I want to crank the engine up, let it run for a few minutes so the oil will warm up and then drain better. Now I'll come over to my drain plug. I want to remove my drain plug, make sure my gasket's in good shape. Then I'll go ahead and look at the rest of my undercarriage here. I want to look at my oil pan, make sure there's no leakage there. Maybe you want to look at my transmission, just make sure everything's in good shape. Then I like to come up to my oil filter. I'll go ahead and twist him off, inspect him, make sure the gasket didn't stick to the block. And then I want to just make sure I put nice film oil on my new oil filter before I reinstall it.
Now while he's doing that, we could take a look at some of the components underneath the vehicle. We have a few here on the wagon. Take a look at the CV axles, the struts, the components, the shocks, whatever's under here. Look at the ball joints. Like Chase said, for any oil leaks, motor mounts, they took it to you because they expected professionals working on their car. Now, when you take a shock absorber, just look at it. It may be leaking externally. You can also do a jounce test. These things go up and down and they leak internally or they may leak externally. They may rattle inside. There's also constant velocity joints. Now, constant velocity joints have a plunge joint on one side and a fixed joint on the other. But this thing's rotating with engine speed, no matter how fast the car is going. Now, you also have these boots. These boots could tear, grease could come out of that. Now, a classic symptom of that, car may turn to the right or left and click. They may need a CV axle. While you're under there, make sure you replace the oil gasket here if it's leaking, and check the torque seal. Make sure it's not broken before you do the oil change. Now I also have a cutaway of an oil filter. What's happening with the oil, it's actually going through these little holes right here. When it goes through these holes, it's going to go here through the anti-drain back valve. And then when it goes past the drain back valve, it runs along the outside of this filter material here. And then what it does, it comes back up and it goes to the engine clean from the center here.
John, I was able to catch some of our used oil if you'd like to show.
Yeah, and this is a perfect reason why they're counting on you to do the oil change. This oil here is spent.
Now that the vehicle is on the ground, locate the recommended oil and capacity, fill it up, and recheck your work.
Now, Tim shared with you earlier the importance of selecting the right oil. And while you're underneath the hood, there's a lot of checks we can make. And come on over here and I'll show you some of them. This vehicle here, you can take a look at the battery right here, make sure the connections are in good shape. Just work your way over to the brake fluid. Look at the level, make sure the brake fluid, make sure the cap's intact. Down here you have the transmission fluid. Now, every vehicle is going to be a little different. You can pull out the transmission fluid, either look at the service manual or read the stick on how to check your vehicle when you're working on it. You could just come over to some of the other checks. Just look at the hoses. Come over here to the air cleaner. Now your air cleaner looks like this right here. It's going to be in there. Make sure that you look at it, inspect it. Also, don't forget about the cabin filter. The cabin filter inside the cabin may look like this here. This cabin filter actually filters the air going inside the car. Make sure that you look at all the systems that are available to you. Come over here to your coolant, check your coolant, and then over here is the power steering fluid. Over here you also have some wiper fluid here that you can use. And when you're checking the belts and hoses, I have a couple examples for you. Your hose may look good, but you want to feel it. Make sure it's pliable. And if you look inside this one, this hose here is not in that good a shape. So you want to go ahead and recommend that to the customer. And most importantly, the belts. Now the belts, there's been a lot of evolution in the belts. There used to be a neoprene belt, and the neoprene belt looks like this. And everybody remembers we would squeeze it and just look at all the cracks. Well, you can't do that anymore because the new belts are EPDM material. And EPDM material, think of an analogy of a tire. A tire wears out, the grooves start to go down and down and down. That's what happens to this belt here. And I have 3 belts here so I can show you. You actually need this little tool here, belt check-in gauge. And what this is here, this is a new belt, an age belt, and a worn belt. So if I put it right here, you can see it's protruding over the top. That's a new belt. That's not worn in those grooves right there. I come over here to this next one, it starts to sink down in there. And then the last belt, it's totally in there, in the grooves of the belt. So what's happening is this belt's actually transferring heat into the pulleys. It may slip. Your customer have issues. So that's a good look at the belts, the hoses. Make sure you inspect the whole entire system so your customer's car will be in tip-top shape. We shared a lot of information when it comes to motor oil. You should now understand the purpose and function of motor oil. Now, as a professional, get out there and share this information with your customers about the important role this motor oil plays in their engine.
And we were able to share some tips and procedures you can use when performing an oil change.
And now that you understand the critical role that engine oil plays in protecting the engine, it's easy to understand why the liquid engineering in this bottle makes Castrol the best choice.